When it comes to disastrous movie productions, there is one that lives in legend. This is the story of Waterworld.
Eyeball?
This story starts in the mid-80s. An aspiring screenwriter, Peter Rader, has conceived of a story for a children's adventure film. Trying his luck to get into Hollywood, he arranges a meeting with Roger Corman. He was responsible for launching the careers of Francis Ford Coppola, James Cameron, and Joe Dante. He was well known as the king of low-budget filmmaking, and this guy to date has over 500 producer credits. Not wanting to shoot down Rader's idea, he told him he could secure funding for a Mad Max ripoff. About the meeting, Rader said,
"One guy who worked for Roger Corman named Brad Cravoy had a meeting with me in which he said, 'Listen, Peter, I got some money from South Africa. If you come up with a good Mad Max ripoff, I'll let you direct it.'"
Rader needed to separate himself from the rest of the 90s post-apocalyptic wasteland films. So he had the idea of setting his film on the high seas.
I was walking around the marina and it just hit me. It was like, what if we did this on water? What if we did Mad Max on water?
Corman read the script. He liked it, but believed the movie would cost at least $5 million to make. Being notoriously low budget, his company eventually passed on the idea. Rader felt he had something with his draft, and compared to what eventually made it to screen, it was much more light-hearted.
You know, he's like a turd that won't flush.
The Mariner was a human being defending the atoll, who had a secret passion for painting seahorses. The villain Deacon was far more ridiculous. Dressed like King Trident, he'd go around and slap his crew in the face with a wet fish. Not wanting to give up, he went through 7 drafts of his script before it left his hands and went to David Towie, known for writing films like Warlock and The Fugitive. At this time, the film started to gain a much more serious tone, and at some point the script wound up in the hands of a young Joss Whedon for an uncredited rewrite. He claimed when the script was handed to him, it was a mess.
Waterworld was a good idea, and the script was the classic. They have a good idea, then they write a generic script and don't really care about the idea. When I was brought in, there was no water in the last 40 pages of the script. It all took place on land or on a ship or whatever. I'm like, isn't the cool thing about this guy that he has gills? And no one was listening.
There was quite a bit of interest in the movie, and seeing an opportunity, Universal Pictures bought the script. Despite it still being unfinished, the movie rushed into production. In an interview with SF Gate, Kevin Costner said,
"We shouldn't have green-lighted this movie until the script was finished. I do movies that I know are already written well, except for Waterworld. From a producing standpoint, I tried to manage and control a story that was not there, and kept trying to build a story."
It quickly gained momentum and landed a pretty average budget of $30 million. Interestingly, movies in production from a similar time, like Mortal Kombat, had a budget of just $18 million, whilst A-list movies like Heat had a budget of $60 million. Set to direct Waterworld was Kevin Reynolds, who Costner had worked with just a few years prior on Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. That movie had a budget of $48 million. With all the cogs turning, they chose to set up production in Hawaii, on an enclosed set, shooting in a large body of open water just off the coast, on these elaborate floating sets. This caused various issues, and the film's budget quickly rose to $65 million, and then came delays in filming. From bad weather to injuries, destroyed sets, and on-set rewrites. One of the reasons so few films take place on open water is that it's hard to get stable shots when the surface is constantly changing. Waterworld found this issue straight away, when camera crews found themselves taking hours to set up relatively simple shots. The movie was slated for 96 days. It eventually wrapped up after 157. Co-star Jeanne Tripplehorn described the madness of the extended shooting schedule.
I just remember sitting next to Dennis Hopper at one point, and I was complaining that we had been there for 3 months and it was the longest I had ever been on a shoot. And Dennis looked at me and said, "Oh no, you want this movie to go on for as long as possible." Of course, we were there for another 3 months.
Audiences agree.
Absolutely spectacular. Awesome.
The biggest adventure movie ever made.
When the production finally wrapped up, the cost had amounted to an unprecedented $175 million.
It's like Waterworld.
Only cheaper.
At the time, making it the most expensive movie ever made. That was until James Cameron's Titanic just 2 years later. But adjusting for inflation, that would be around $320 million in today's money. That's the same budget for Avengers Infinity War in 2018. It's reported that Costner himself invested $22 million of his own money in the production, which works out the same amount as it was to create the film's floating atoll set. But it wasn't long into production before Costner appointed himself as a backseat director. He was on set every day, working 6 days a week, and despite his commitment to the film, his actions led to some on-set friction. Throughout the production, Costner had checked himself into a private waterfront Hawaiian villa that cost $4,500 per night, paid for by the movie's budget, while the other crew members stayed in sweltering hot condos void of any air conditioning. It's also rumoured that Costner even employed the visual effects team to digitally erase his receding hairline from the film, a task that proved quite costly at the time. However, Costner strongly denied this, and speaking to CNN in 1995, he said,
"I was so surprised that it came from Newsweek. No matter if they cite a source, it's just bullshit, and they're just bullshit for printing it."
What is true, however, is that during the middle of production, Costner ended his marriage with his wife of 16 years. In an article with People magazine, he allegedly spent much of his off time hooking up with a married Hawaiian hula dancer, who performed at a local hotel. Her husband denied the affair took place, but the story gained interest regardless. However, she wasn't the only one, as Costner reportedly made his way around the set while his breakup was happening, and banned all tabloids from his direct view. So going back to a relationship with Kevin Costner and director Kevin Reynolds, they'd been pals for many years and had worked on movies together since the 80s. Reynolds had given Costner a role in his film Fandango. They later collaborated on Dances with Wolves, with Costner directing under the guidance of Reynolds.
It's a big fight. Start to back up, looking at the punny, you're scared. Get on your knees, Willie, tell her to run.
And then, just a few years later, their well-received Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. But cracks in their friendship had already started as Costner's fame began to rise. It was on the set of Waterworld that their friendship met its breaking point.
I'm gonna push off, and I'm gonna try and catch up with the plane.
Reynolds was already buckling under the stress of filming the bloated movie, but coming head-to-head with Costner over creative control proved to be the final straw. It's reported that Costner even locked Reynolds out of the editing room and asserted himself as boss, leaving Reynolds feeling he had no choice but to walk away. Speaking to Entertainment Weekly, he said,
"In the future, Costner should only appear in pictures he directs himself. That way he can always be working with his favorite actor and his favorite director."
Costner responded with,
"At the end of the day, you've got to get the work done. And that's what I'm about."
While Costner was furious that Reynolds had abandoned ship, Dennis Hopper, who played Deacon, felt differently.
"When a movie costs this much, the studio and the producers come in and get involved. He turned over his director's cut and said, 'I quit. Fight it out amongst yourselves. Here's the movie.' I find that right."
However, despite leaving in the middle of post-production, Reynolds actually managed to cut together his own version of the film, one that to this day has never come out of the vault. Those who have seen it say it's a more conventional action film that dispenses with a somber tone of Costner's cut. So whilst all this was happening behind the scenes, the struggling cast and crew of Waterworld enjoyed an almost year-long shoot. Taking its toll on them, problems in production were commonplace, from frequent injuries to near drownings. While most of them were minor, the worst occurred when stunt coordinator Norman Howell suffered a near-fatal embolism while filming a deep-sea dive. Howell had to be flown by helicopter to a hospital in Honolulu, where he had to recover in a decompression chamber. Another time, a famous big wave surfer, Bill Hamilton, who served as Costner's stunt double for several scenes, he was shooting a scene taking place on the open ocean when he was carried out to sea and nearly drowned. Director Kevin Reynolds described the incident.
The AD came in and told me one of the stunt guys was missing at sea. I said, "What do you mean? We aren't even shooting at sea." We were shooting on the Big Island, and this guy was Bill Hamilton, this legendary big wave surfer. He had been taking a jet ski across this channel from the Big Island to Maui, where his home was, and he'd stay for the weekend. He'd get up before dawn on Monday and drive it back 40 miles across the ocean, and he hadn't shown up that morning for work. They called his wife, and she said he left for work. We sent the production helicopter out to try to find him, and they couldn't find him. We thought he was lost at sea. Toward the end of the day, they finally found him, floating way out in the channel, about to be swept out to sea.
Costner himself also had a brush with death, while strapped to a boat mast for 2 hours, with a helicopter just several meters away and a fierce gale blowing. Costner himself said about the incident,
"I've read about the Twilight Zone and every fucking thing else. The helicopter was about 20 feet away from me."
With injuries and complaints rising high, this meant that the production suffered from an incredibly high turnover of crew. According to a Los Angeles Times article released during the movie's filming, several members of the nearly 500-person crew have either been fired or walked off the picture, including assistant director Alan Curtis, who reportedly left over creative differences. Not much is known about who Curtis butted heads with, but it is rare for an assistant director to leave during mid-production, as they're usually in charge of liaising with the director and making sure that the day-to-day production runs smoothly. As a result of this, and with production taking place in a remote part of Hawaii, they had to employ a lot of local contractors to take care of everything, from craft services to construction. And with so much demand, some contractors raised their prices ridiculously high. According to Ginger Peterson, Waterworld's location manager,
companies knew they were the only games in town and took advantage.
Director Kevin Reynolds stated that the Waterworld set was already insane by the time he arrived in Hawaii to start filming. For the Newsweek's 20th anniversary of the film, he said,
"The set wasn't a 3-ring circus. It was a 12-ring circus. The scale was enormous, especially the giant floating set, the atoll. We had hundreds of extras, dozens and dozens of guys on jet skis, and helicopters with cameras on them."
The incredible floating atoll set where much of the movie takes place cost roughly $22 million to build. The set was 1/4 mile in circumference, weighing almost 1,000 tons. However, neither the atoll nor the 30+ boats that feature in the film came with any toilet facilities, meaning filming had to be stopped periodically for people to be transported to a nearby ship to use the bathroom. The size of the atoll meant it required every piece of steel in Hawaii, and when that wasn't enough, more had to be flown in from California. Despite costing a fortune, the film helped inject roughly $35 million into the local Hawaiian economy. So where did all this extra budget go? Well, one of the main factors that broke the budget were the production delays. These happened when sets were either destroyed or sank into the ocean. The production had to be shut down more than 3 times due to weather warnings. As a result, these million-dollar sets were completely destroyed by hurricanes. While some could be salvaged, others had to be rebuilt entirely, and some were completely lost to the ocean floor, causing Onset script rewrites, which meant the entire Slaver faction subplot was removed. Having to rebuild the sets prolonged the shoot and substantially increased the budget. Some of the additional filming eventually had to be done in Los Angeles, Santa Catalina, Huntington Beach, and the Channel Islands. In anticipation of the movie's release, Waterworld did inspire some video game adaptations.
Game over. Please deposit 40 quarters.
What a rip!
Nintendo developed a movie-based one for its Super NES, Game Boy, and Virtual Boy consoles. It was the only movie based on a game ever to feature on the Virtual Boy, which, like Waterworld, also didn't do very well. Sega had also worked on a video game of Waterworld for its Genesis and Saturn consoles, but decided to scrap the project release once development was completed. A PC game called Waterworld: The Quest for Dry Land was later released in 1997 with mixed reviews. Waterworld may have gone down in history as a Hollywood cautionary tale, and its reputation for being a complete failure is only half true. With a cost of $175 million, it eventually went on to make $260 million at the box office, but with additional Hollywood marketing costs, traditionally the same as the budget, the studios received a minor cut of takings from the cinema chains. Waterworld ultimately lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Despite that, the movie did little to hurt the careers of Reynolds and Costner, who eventually made amends, reuniting for the TV series Hatfields and McCoys in 2012. And in the era of bad remakes and, even worse, reboots, Waterworld hasn't been overlooked. In fact, a remake is in the works as a television series, supposedly with director Dan Trachtenberg showrunning. However, a release date has not yet been slated. Could a Waterworld TV series work? Probably. I think one of the reasons Waterworld failed before was overambition, resulting in disagreements over creative control and a ballooning budget, but with the evolution of CGI, special effects have come a long way since the 90s. And a remake could easily bring a creator's vision to completion with far less cost and injuries. But what do you think? Well, that's it from me. Thanks for watching and take it easy.
Could you be more specific?
It was like having to watch Waterworld for a month!